Joining me now live to discuss this is former Pentagon Adviser and a Commander in the US Navy Reserve, Jason Israel. Jason, good morning. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Danica, and thanks as always for mentioning my Navy Reserve affiliation. As always, as I'm not on duty, a reminder that these views are my own.
Absolutely. Jason, we finally, after a very long time, have seen this Phase 1 trade deal signed. What do you make of this first step?
So the first step, there are a couple of factors here. I will divide it into two areas. One is, as you heard, the $200 billion in extra U.S. products that China has committed to purchasing. And then the second are all of the commitments that they've made separately, which are regular complaints that the U.S. have had, that China would devalue its currency to make it more competitive, that China would force transfer of technology, and that China would remove intellectual property by theft or by other means. And so there are some commitments in that category, but let's just leave that to the side and say that there are questions about how that would be enforced. However, there is good, positive language in this 86-page agreement and 9 chapters of the agreement that includes in that. Let's go back to the $200 billion of increased commitments. Now, first of all, China has not increased the internal quotas that it has for buying things like U.S. grain, corn, wheat, and rice. That's not necessarily a bad thing because China doesn't come even close to purchasing the quotas that it has for foreign agricultural products. So it's very possible China can make these increases that it says without actually increasing its internal quotas. However, the fact that China has not actually increased its quotas will be a question for the U.S. because the U.S. can't. The question will be how can they enforce or track that China will actually make those purposes. On the home front, two important factors. One is, as it was mentioned, this is an election year. This is going to be good for U.S. farmers here in the next 8 to 10 months. And as a reminder, the U.S. government has bailed out farmers to the tune of $28 billion over the last couple of years since the China-U.S. trade war has started, double the amount of the auto buyout, the auto bailout about 10 years ago. So a reminder of what is on farmers' minds as we go into an election. And then the second question is, can the U.S. agricultural system actually produce this many more agricultural goods? Can the manufacturing sector spin up over the next year, over the next 2 years to actually meet this demand of the new Chinese purchases? And then there's a question of course, this defies what we've been doing for the last 30 years, free market principles. Does this remove the competitive advantage system that has actually moved things like the WTO and the rules-based liberal order along? So a lot of those questions in. There is good language in the agreement, but there's a lot of questions about enforcement and also what this $200 billion actually means.
Do you think that, given it's been particularly quite a tit-for-tat trade war so far, do you think that this could put the two superpowers on a more positive route?
I believe that the U.S. and China relationship is still going to be tactical. It's still going to be very much based on what each side can get out of it. That's how President Trump and President Xi have clearly framed it. When they stand in front of the stage and they hold a signed document and smile, it's clearly a part that both sides feel that it meets their national interests for now. We have to remember that looking forward 20 years, China sees themselves as the largest economy in the world, and they want to shape what that looks like. What kind of economy do they have? What kind of coercion and other types of power do they have over other economies? So they're looking through that. The question is, how far in advance is the U.S. looking when it comes to this agreement? Is it looking to November? Obviously, for the election, there are some pieces there, but some of this looks past that to say, look, we want to change Chinese behavior that has been unfair against the U.S. and other countries for decades. So I still think very much a transactional relationship for now, and we can't expect anything further.
Let's move on now to the situation with Iran. Overnight, the President, Hassan Rouhani, dismissed calls for a new Trump deal, which aimed at resolving these nuclear tensions between the two nations. Jason, a week or so on from when this conflict did appear to ramp up, where are we at? And was Qasem Soleimani, whose death really sparked all of this, an imminent threat?
Great. Two important questions. One is, where we are is still in a relative period of de-escalation of hostilities. And that's not a surprise, because as we talked about last week, what are the strategic goals of both sides? Neither wants to escalate into a full-scale war, but both sides need to sort of save face with their domestic populations and with the global population. And the way things panned out last week include that. And of course, the tragedy, as we talked about, of 176 deaths of a civilian airliner really changed the dynamic of that as well, because Iran has had to look internally for the last several days for good reason to address that tragedy. So when it comes to, so that's one question. The second question on whether the Soleimani strike was done in accordance with, let's say, U.S. law or customary international law comes down to that word that you used, which was imminent. Was Soleimani an imminent threat? Was there a specific attack? And as you may have seen over the last week, there's been a lot of deliberations in the United States over whether or not specific intelligence about a specific attack led to that imminent threat. Imminent is very difficult to define. I will go back, and feel free for the viewers to look up just on Google the two documents that the Obama administration put out publicly. One was a fact sheet about the way these operations are completed, and one was the declassification of the procedures by which operations like this are completed. The top secret document was declassified in the last few months of the Obama presidency because President Obama felt like we needed to really make these procedures we used transparent so the public could debate and decide how those types of operations should be conducted, and it always comes down to that word imminent.
The European nations this week have triggered an EU dispute mechanism in response to this. If attempts to resolve the dispute, Jason, don't pan out, could the entire agreement be scrapped?
That's right, Danica. So the way that this mechanism that the EU countries triggered works is that now they have about 2 months, I believe it's 65 days, for Iran and the other parties to come back and create a constructive way ahead. The question is, would the United States possibly be back involved in that agreement? And it looks like no. President Trump has political reasons and, of course, his own personal stake for saying that he doesn't believe that the original agreement was a good one. So having him come back in is very unlikely. And having Iran come back in underneath those restrictions of the agreement without the United States, having them come back into the agreement without the United States and all of the other parties in agreement would be pretty unlikely. So we'll probably see is this over this 65 days, there will be discussion and there will be public commitments, but it's very difficult to see an actual return to the agreement during this time. What that means is if this agreement goes after 65 days is the UN sanctions can kick back in, and that includes a full-on weapons embargo against Iran. So yet more ramp up of sanctions.
And just on another matter, a provisional ceasefire has been reached between Libya's warring factions. Why is this so significant?
Yep, it's always good to check in on these conflicts. I mean, the conflict in Libya is 2 years old now, with General Khalifa having risen to power against the provisional government. So leaving the details of that aside, one of the things that's most important is we're seeing great power dynamics. You see Russia and even Turkey, a U.S. NATO ally, coming together to try to show that they are the leaders in a Libya ceasefire. So in Moscow, they just held talks where they're trying to get the provisional government and General Khalifa to hold a ceasefire. And in the EU, they're still trying to hold on to what they historically had as a peacemaking role for that region. So what you actually see is almost competing peace talks that are going on here. So that is the story amongst itself as they're trying to get to a Libyan ceasefire, is that you have multiple different parties trying to show that they are now the leaders of the global community when it comes to trying to reduce conflict in such regions. Very important trend for us to follow.